Okay, I know I'm gonna hate this. That time Jordan Peterson responded to the feminist in the balcony. I'm gonna hate this.
Voice as there will be no microphone to the lady in the black.
Thank you. So, as you were talking about hierarchy and the relationship that conservatives and liberals have towards it, I was wondering
Is there these subtitles? No.
whether that formulation is also a kind of attack on individual sovereignty and a kind of tribalism of saying here are these two groups of people and here's how they relate to hierarchy, here are their characteristics.
Yeah, I didn't hear that word. How do they relate to something? Sovereignty? Did you get that? I really wish they could have a microphone.
And here's how they relate and a kind of tribalism of saying here
Right.
whether that formulation is also a kind of attack on individual sovereignty
Is individual? That would make sense, right?
and a kind of tribalism of saying here are these two groups of people and here's how they relate to hierarchy, here are their characteristics.
Yes, that's great.
Well, it would be if I was trying to reduce all the individual variability to that. But to note that people vary across a dimension is not necessarily simultaneously to limit all the variability to those dimensions. There's lots of other variability. And your question to some degree is whether the act of categorization is in itself a limitation on individual freedom, I think, if you push your question all the way down to the bottom. And the answer to that is, to some degree, yes, but it's also a precondition for individual freedom. So, is that sufficient?
Like, I hate how these people, they like laugh for no like good reason. Like, because he does his sort of snotty looks and then they laugh. I really, I really hate Jordan Peterson. Like, really, I don't know. They pretend that he's like polite and stuff, but he's such a sort of smart ass person. Like, fucking, I really hate him.
But you sort of do have
And I like and I hate like his audience. I hate and Ben Shapiro audience. Like they're such morons, you know, and such like evil little like demons.
predispositions that you're giving in the same way in which people from political correctness are trying to say this is what it means to be a woman, these are the kind of things that it is expected from a woman to do to defend herself. And it seems to me that you are making a similar claim about this is what conservative people do, and this is how they always relate to hierarchy.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I would say that I perhaps am doing that, but I don't see how that's the same as what the postmodernists are doing. I mean,
It's equivalent. Like honestly, it's equivalent, and you're doing identity politics basically, because what you're doing is you're saying men are like this, women are like that, or women are like that, and like it's unnatural if they sort of try to do differently. Like obviously you don't quite ever say it out loud, so then and then you sort of backtrack when somebody's actually confronting you on that. You kind of backtrack and you say no, it's not equivalent, blah blah blah. But in practice, what you're doing you're influencing people to subconsciously adopt identity politics.
as far as I can tell, the postmodernists aren't saying that the groups, the individuals within those groups, are characterized by any stable characteristics whatsoever, except for the fact of their comparative oppression. Like, so I don't understand the first part of your argument. I mean, part of the reason the postmodern types have been going after me is because I've dared to say that men and women differ in temperament, which, by the way, they do. So, now, you know, that's actually something that might be worth just differentiating quickly, because
Yeah, but again, on average, and the problem is that what you're doing is that you're failing to properly emphasize that, and as a result, what people are gonna, you know, in practice, what people are gonna take away from your thing is that men and women are different. So just that, you know, there are these categories, and they're men and they're women, and men act like this and women act like that, and it's unnatural if people don't act like that. And like it's okay to make fun of men if they act in a sort of non-stereotypically masculine fashion. And again, I'm not going to say men and women. I said I would start saying women for what currently is called men. So to be able to use the word men to refer to proper humans. So like you've got men, you've got you got women, and you've got women, and like you know the males act this way and the females act this other way, and yeah, and you should, and basically it's going to lead to people, because you know that these sort of, you know, right wing Jordan Peterson type fans, they're the kind of people who'll make fun of anyone who doesn't conform to sort of gender stereotypes, right? You know that if a man doesn't act like macho enough, they'll make fun of that man. If a woman doesn't act macho enough, they'll make fun of that woman. And again, but I don't say woman because precisely for me, woman is somebody who intentionally acts in like an obnoxiously, stereotypically masculine way. So I'll just say male and female. If a male doesn't act in a masculine enough manner, they'll make fun of that male. And similarly, that if a female acts in a manner that's not deemed feminine enough, then they'll say, "Oh, you're like an obnoxious butch lesbian, whatever." Um, we know that that is the actual type of people that watch Jordan Peterson. That is actually what they believe in, how they act. They're really just savages who that is what they will basically take away from what Jordan Peterson is saying, right? Come on, they're not gonna take away that, oh, we should just respect individuals to act however they want, right? They're not gonna, that is not what they're gonna take away from that. It's not, they're not gonna be, like emboldened to, or like motivated, driven, thanks to Jordan Peterson, to be more like tolerant of differences between people. No, I don't think that that is what Jordan Peterson is doing, and it's like, and it's obvious because Jordan Peterson fundamentally doesn't want that.
It's actually technically somewhat challenging, but also very much worth knowing. I was debating someone on a panel this morning on a TV show, The Right Stuff, and this was a woman who led the Women's Equality Party, and she cited some psychological literature that purported to claim that men and women were mostly the same. And that's actually true. We are more the same than different. If you look at our temperaments, there's more overlap than there is variance by a substantial amount.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Thank you for saying that. I still question why you even like bother to do all your things. Basically, what you're like, even when you see, like, when Jordan is confronted with this, like he sort of insists more on this kind of aspect. But the point is, like, why are you even going around doing lectures on this sort of thing if people are mostly the same?
And so even on the temperamental dimensions where there is most difference between men and women, the difference isn't of massive magnitude at the center of the distribution. So for example, women are less aggressive than men, which is, by the way, why they try to commit suicide more often, but are much less lethal in their actions. That's one example, but there are many examples. If you draw a random woman and a random man out of the population, the probability that the man will be more aggressive is 60%. If you bet on the man, you'd win 60% of the time. That's not a walloping difference. It's not 95% of the time. It's a difference that is substantive, it's significant, it's measurable, but it's not large by the standards by which such things are judged.
Well, we agree on that, but again, the problem is that Jordan is trying to get you to some place that he doesn't quite say. Why is he doing this? What are his actual policies? And he doesn't really mention his policies, but basically we can imagine that he somehow wants to create a society that makes people end up adopting stereotypical, old-fashioned societal norms, and that basically a society that that frowns upon and even oppresses people who don't do that.
But that's not the point. The point is that most of the activity takes place at the extremes. So out on the tails of the distribution. So here's an example. About 9 out of 10 people in prison are male.
Yeah.
Why? Because to be in prison, you have to be the most aggressive person, let's say, in 100. Okay. Those differences at the midpoint are large enough so that if you go out to the extremes, 1 in 100 people, you have an overwhelming preponderance of men.
Yeah, and that is true.
And so you can have...
Just like there's an overwhelming preponderance of men, of women, whether it's males, male humans among really tall people, right? It's kind of the same principle.
Have your cake and eat it too. You can say, well, yeah, broadly speaking, men and women are more the same than different. The overlap is greater than the disjunction. But
that is true.
That's not relevant if what's being selected is often at the extremes, and it often is.
And so what he's saying is also So what he's gonna probably add is that people like at the top in terms of like competence are also overwhelmingly males, and that's why you have overwhelmingly males at the top of companies. And that is true. That like I don't think that there's again I don't think that there's much, the fact that a majority of men are in prison of males are in prison is a result of that, and also the fact that the majority of males are at the top of companies is also a result of that. And so there isn't really an issue of discrimination against males for the regarding incarceration rate, and there isn't discrimination against females regarding the fact that there are more people at the top that are males. Um, and by and large, I just don't think there is all that much discrimination anymore. And I think that that is a mistake of these sort of lefty people is to think, oh, there's ongoing discrimination. And actually, no, there isn't ongoing discrimination against particular groups. That there is a bit, but like not all that much, and it's not all that much, not all that significant. And so that really is a mistake. This idea that there's like lots of I mean, because if you're going to like claim that there's systemic discrimination, why aren't you going to claim systemic discrimination against males, that are in prison, right? Why isn't that systemic discrimination against males? The fact that males get convicted, probably, there's this idea that black people get convicted for the same crime a lot more than white people do, but I'm sure the same can be said for males versus females. And yet, why do all these lefty people not complain about that? Because that's not part of their narrative. Males have not been historically oppressed, and in particular, white males haven't. So, so they don't care, and they completely ignore that. And so, and unfortunately, and the thing is that here, like Jordan sort of says that it's normal that there's more like males in prison, but in other times he has mentioned that as a sort of fact that to sort of indicate that males are actually sort of being oppressed or something, or that was sort of what he made you want to see. Um, and so again, that's pretty ironic. That's very inconsistent, and that's a sort of typical right winger thing to do. But like I'm saying, these left wing people that are complaining about discrimination on the basis of sex and like race and etc., that they're mostly wrong, and right wingers are actually right about saying that that's mostly wrong. Um, Unfortunately, in the United States, that almost seems to be like the main like axis of activism. It seems like to be even the most important political stances for many people, and unfortunately, those political stances are just wrong because there isn't really much of a wrong to rectify. So, so yeah, that's kind of it's silly. It's silly because then like to a large extent the biggest like policy position of Republicans, left wingers in other countries, right wingers in other countries, is precisely resistance to those things. Like that is what motivates them the most. In fact, you see like these people like the followers of Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro. What gets them the most animated is precisely when these people criticize those genuinely mistaken aspects of leftism. And so basically, what you have is leftists that are perceiving a wrong when there is largely none, and then rightists using that to attack leftists and to defend also all the rest of their policy positions, which which are wrong, right? All the rest of the rightist positions are wrong, but they use this wrong of the leftists to defend everything else that the rightists believe in, right? They say, well, look, the leftists do this wrong, and we are right about that, and so presumably, well, we're going to be right about everything else, right? That's kind of the reasoning, and that's what they want you to see, and 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 so it's silly because, and of course, what they also do is they just exaggerate that the importance of what these leftists are doing, like the threat that it represents. Because in fact, okay, that they're trying to unfairly rectify wrongs that don't exist, and it is mistaken, but like it's not all that big a deal. And like these right wing people sort of make it a much bigger of a deal than it is. So basically, the left wings make a big deal out of slight discrimination and also see discrimination when there's none, and then the right wingers make a big deal out of what the left wingers are doing based on that. So it's just ridiculous. It's two sides that are just being ridiculous, and it's like probably the major cause of like polarization, political polarization, and especially in the United States. And it's like literally a polarization that's based on like idiocy and like non-facts on both sides.
So for example, with regards to engineering, there's a fair bit of evidence that people who are more interested in things than in people become engineers. Now, that's not really going to be, what is that, shocking? Are you shocked by that? You shouldn't be shocked by that, right? You can tell that not only by what engineers do, but you can tell that by how they think, and you can tell that just by talking to them, if you know a bunch of engineers. So, and it turns out that the largest temperamental difference that's known between men and women is actually interest in people versus interest in things. And so it has nothing to do with competence, but it has a lot to do with interest. And because you have to be very interested in things to go be an engineer, because that's all you're going to be doing if you're an engineer, then only those people who are extremely interested in things tend to become engineers. And most of them are men. And that's why even in places like Scandinavia, where a tremendous amount of effort has been put into flattening the sociocultural landscape, and successfully, by the way, there's still a preponderance of male engineers. And there's a preponderance of female nurses.
And he says successfully, but in other times he said unsuccessfully, because he said that in Scandinavia, where there's actually the biggest gap between men and women in terms of career, choices. So again, he's contradicting himself with respect to previous times.
And no matter how much sociological gerrymandering goes on, those statistics have remained quite intractable over about a 15-year period. And so there are differences. They're not massive.
And so he's right about that. But then the problem is that is good argumentation if you're saying, okay, if you're trying to make the case for saying that there's no discrimination against people, or like that there's minimal discrimination against people, that it's not all that big of an issue. That is perfectly like good argumentation for that. The problem is that then that there's this whole subtext where Jordan is actually, slyly implying all sorts of other policy proposals that go beyond just not crying discrimination when there isn't any, right? What he's actually trying to get you to do is to support some sort of idealized traditional family system, and to kind of discriminate against people who don't follow that. That is essentially what he's trying to do.
And then you might ask, well, are those sociocultural or biological? It's like, well, that's a hard question to answer, because it depends on how much variability there is in the sociocultural landscape, because the proportion by which something is biological versus sociocultural varies with the sociocultural landscape. That's a complicated thing to digest, because you think of those things as fixed, but they're not. So, but what we have demonstrated quite clearly, and this is mainstream science, despite the fact that people don't like it, this test has already been done. So we developed a personality model that's pretty stable across cultures, purely derived from statistical processes, an atheoretical model if there ever was one, and quite an unattractive model because of that, conceptually, but that's beside the point. Then we saw cross-culturally whether there were differences in the fundamental temperaments of men and women, and the answer was yes, cross-culturally, quite robust. Women are higher in the experience of anxiety and emotional pain, and they're more compassionate and agreeable. Those are the big differences, and they're differences of a magnitude that I already pointed out.
Yeah, but but again, like there's more overlap than there's differences. So again, the problem is because there's more overlap than differences. This means that it makes no sense to treat all women in one way and treat all women, and again, maybe males and females, to treat all females one way and males in another way, right? It makes no sense to do that because mostly there's overlap. So it would make much more sense to treat everyone the same. And basically that is not what Jordan Peterson wants. He completely kind of avoids that aspect of his ideology when he's sort of being confronted on it, right? But that if you look at other times, when he's talking about things, he'll be saying things like, oh, most women will be happier to be like at home rather than working, which again is fine, but at the same time then he says like, be disciplined and you got to work, and it's like he's against sort of, you know, benefits and stuff like that because like it doesn't get you to work. He had to answer a question on basic income, and he says like, oh, I knew some people who had money but didn't have to work, and they got into drugs. And so like he keeps shifting, this stuff away from the target. Whenever somebody's calling him out for something, he'll move to some other aspect of his ideology, which then is not going to be like, which you're not confronting him on currently. So you really have to confront him on everything kind of at the same time to be able to properly nab him, because otherwise he'll just move away to some other theme, and he'll kind of explain his thing by moving away to another theme. So, I mean, we know, for instance, that he doesn't support basic income, which means that he doesn't support like, people being able to be idle on their own, including parents on their own. So obviously, but at the same time, we know that he thinks that most females would be happier to not work and just be stay-at-home like partners, and in particular mothers, which is again kind of ironic considering that he's at the same time like very pro-jobism and says, oh, you should get a job, but in fact that is very much intended towards the males. It's also, of course, intended towards females when they're not working, but in a lefty way, like being sort of hippie. Then they then get to work and all that, or get a family, like. But it's again, it's very ironic, and again, it's very inconsistent. You got to be able to really see that. And so what we know is that actually he wants women, obviously, he thinks it's better for women not to work, which again completely contradicts this fact that he says, okay, lift yourself up by your bootstraps and everything. But we also know that since he doesn't support basic income, that he wants women to be dependent on men, right? So so what he's advocating for is a system where women are dependent on men, which is not a good thing, because that means that, for instance, if the male is abusive, that the female cannot escape properly, and I think that's not a good thing at all. Which is why, I mean, that's one of the important reasons why I think basic income is important, and not even just abusive, but just like unpleasant to be around with, like you just don't really like that person, but you still have to stay because, you don't have like a job, you've got kids to take care of, and, you don't want to just uproot that, for your kids, you'll stay with that person, etc. With basic income, you could just go. But what Jordan wants is for women not to work and to be dependent. He wants this dependency on particular individuals as opposed to the government. Otherwise, you'd be dependent to the government with basic income. But I don't see why that is actually a problem. It's much less of a problem. It's even a non-problem. So that, again, just bear that all in mind. I already explained all this in my like big video, 3-hour video that I made on Jordan Peterson. But again, this is something to bear in mind. Jordan is he's doing this, and like what he wants is these gender rules that are oppressive towards everyone. It's oppressive towards females because it makes them dependent on particular people, particular male people, and it's oppressive to males because it makes them kind of have to toughen up and not be weak and have to work a lot, so this is not good for anybody.
Then the next question is, well, to what degree is that biological versus sociocultural? And it's complicated because that variable depends on the sociocultural landscape, but we'll put that aside. You can determine that by stacking up countries from those who have done everything they possibly can to flatten out the sociocultural landscape in relationship to gender, to those who haven't, that are still very stratified by sex. And then what you do is you look at the magnitude of the temperament differences in keeping with the variability that those countries have in terms of their sociocultural egalitarianism. And the sociocultural types, the social constructionists, their prediction is, as cultures become more egalitarian, men and women become more different, more the same, because it's environmental. That isn't what happens. Exactly the opposite happens. as you flatten out the sociocultural landscape, men and women become more different. The data is in. The experiment is done. Tens of thousands of people, multiple countries. And it's not what anyone expected. And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like,
okay, so maybe he didn't contradict himself on the Scandinavia thing. It's maybe more when he said successfully is actually he means that. When he said Scandinavia managed to, to create like more equalities, he meant like equalities of opportunity, and which led to actually greater difference between the sexes.
All the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair.
Okay. Well, at least he admitted to be right-wing at this point. So that's pretty good.